New developments tonight in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie. Late today, the sheriff saying all family members have been cleared in her disappearance, aware of the online chatter and speculation surrounding this case.
Guthrie. There is a particular kind of loyalty that does not appear in contracts or job descriptions. It lives in hospital waiting rooms and in the silence between two people who already know what the other is feeling. It shows up at 4 in the morning when the alarm sounds and the world is still dark, and it quietly drives a woman back into a life she had already said goodbye to. At 61 years old, Hoda Kotb has demonstrated that kind of loyalty. She came back to the Today Show not because NBC asked her to, not because her publicist thought it would be good for her brand, but because her closest friend was living through a nightmare, and Hoda was not the kind of woman who lets a friend face a nightmare alone. When Hoda Kotb announced in September 2024 that she was stepping away from the Today Show, it felt like the end of a chapter that America had been reading for more than 2 decades. She had spent 26 years at NBC News, rising from a reporter covering Hurricane Katrina to one of the most recognizable faces in morning television. Her final broadcast aired on January 10, 2025, and it was an occasion that warranted the network's largest available studio space at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Fans lined up outside in the January cold. Her 2 daughters, Haley and Hope, sat on the set beside her, and colleagues from across the network's history came to say farewell. It was the kind of goodbye that felt permanent, and Hoda meant it to be. She moved to a home in Westchester County, New York, and began constructing the life she had long deferred. Her youngest daughter, Hope, had been dealing with serious health challenges, and Hoda had publicly credited the desire to be fully present for her children as a core reason for her departure. She founded a wellness company called Joy 101, began development on a health-focused app, and embraced the rhythms of private life, school pickup, PTA meetings, walks in the neighborhood, and mornings that did not begin before sunrise. For over a year, that life held. Then, in the early hours of February 1, 2026, everything shifted. That night, in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie, the mother of Savannah Guthrie, vanished from her home. The circumstances were immediately alarming. There were signs of a struggle. Her phone was found still plugged into the charger in the kitchen. The doorbell camera had gone dark at 1:47 in the morning. By the time her family realized what had happened, the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department were already treating the case as an abduction. Savannah left the Today Show anchor desk and flew to Arizona without hesitation, as any daughter would. And within days, Hoda Kotb quietly reversed the most significant professional decision she had made in years. On February 9, 2026, Hoda Kotb returned to Studio 1A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. She was not there as a guest, not as a fill-in for a single morning, but as a working anchor resuming her full responsibilities beside Craig Melvin. The staff, by all accounts, received her presence the way a ship receives a lighthouse during a storm, with profound and immediate relief. The anchor chair beside Craig had felt conspicuously empty in the days since Savannah's departure, and the weight of covering a story so personally tied to one of the show's own central figures had landed heavily on everyone in the building. Hoda told viewers plainly why she was back. She did not dress it up in network language or strategic framing. She said she was there so that Savannah could remain in Arizona and focus entirely on finding her mother. In the grammar of the morning news world, that explanation was almost shockingly simple. There was no announcement in advance, no press release, no carefully managed rollout. There was just a woman who had made a promise to her friend and was now keeping it in most visible way she knew how. What made her return even more striking was what she gave up to make it. Both Hoda and Savannah had been scheduled to travel to Milan and Cortina d'Ampezzo to provide coverage of the 2026 Winter Olympics. It was a significant assignment, one that required extensive preparation and represented a major investment by NBC. Hoda surrendered her Olympic trip without apparent hesitation. Savannah, for obvious reasons, had already had her own plans redirected. The network absorbed the logistical and financial consequences. The message sent to viewers, to colleagues, and to the journalists who cover television was unmistakable. The Today Show's stated identity as a family was, at least in this instance, something more than a marketing phrase. To understand why Savannah's reaction to her mother's disappearance carried such emotional intensity, it is necessary to understand who Nancy Guthrie is and what she has represented in her daughter's life. Nancy was born in Kentucky and attended the University of Kentucky, where she worked on the student newspaper, a detail that carries a certain resonance given the profession her daughter would eventually build. In the early 1970s, she and her husband Charles relocated to Australia, where he worked as a mining engineer. Savannah was born in Melbourne in 1971. 2 years later, the family returned to Tucson, which had become their permanent home. In 1988, when Savannah was 16 years old, Charles Guthrie died of a heart attack while on a business trip in Mexico. He was 49. The loss was sudden and shattering. Nancy was left without her husband, and with 3 children to raise in a city far from her Kentucky roots. The manner in which she responded to that loss defined her in the eyes of her children for the rest of her life. Rather than allowing grief to immobilize her, she went to work at the University of Arizona, specifically to ensure that all 3 of her children could afford to attend college. She did not seek sympathy. She built a structure. Savannah has described her mother in interviews over the years as someone possessing a quality of hardness that is almost geological, granite, iron, something that does not bend. By the time of her disappearance, Nancy had lived in Tucson for more than half a century. She was 84, living independently in a home in the Catalina foothills, attending a Baptist church each Sunday, and remaining deeply connected to her children and grandchildren. She had limited mobility and required daily medication for a heart condition, including a pacemaker that needed careful monitoring. On the night of January 31, 2026, her daughter Annie and Annie's husband had dinner with her and dropped her off at home around 9:50 in the evening. It was the last time any member of her family saw her. The next morning, she was gone. For the first several days after Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, investigators focused on building a picture of what had happened inside the Catalina foothills home. The evidence told a disturbing story. The back door had been forced open. Inside, a lamp had been knocked over, and a small rug was bunched up near the kitchen island, the kind of disarray that suggested someone had been moved against their will. Blood was found on the porch. Forensic analysis confirmed it belonged to Nancy. A second DNA profile was also recovered from a scene, suggesting the intruder had been injured during the encounter, or that the 84-year-old woman had managed to put up a fight. The doorbell camera's disconnection at 1:47 a.m. suggested someone familiar enough with residential surveillance systems to neutralize the recording before acting. Doorbell footage from before the camera went dark captured the image of a figure crossing the driveway. The person was wearing a dark hoodie, a tactical mask covering the lower half of their face, and a backpack identified as an Ozark Trail model commonly sold at large retail chains. The individual appeared to be roughly 5 feet 10 inches tall, with an athletic build, and was carrying both a handgun and a small flashlight. The deliberate, unhurried movement in the footage led investigators to conclude the person had surveilled the home in advance and knew the layout. This was not a crime of opportunity. On February 3, 2026, the nature of the investigation changed irrevocably. At 1:12 in the afternoon, an email arrived simultaneously at the offices of TMZ and 2 local television stations in Tucson. It was a ransom demand. The message was written in the cold, transactional language of a business contract rather than the frantic phrasing of a desperate criminal. It demanded $4 million in Bitcoin, payable by February 5th. If that deadline passed without payment, the price would increase to $6 million, with a final deadline of February 9th at 5 p.m. local time. The detail in the note gave investigators no choice but to treat it seriously. The sender described with precision what Nancy had been wearing at the time of her abduction, information the Pima County Sheriff's Department had not released publicly. There was also a reference to a specific item that had been damaged inside the home during the struggle, information that could only have come from someone present at the scene. The FBI immediately began monitoring the cryptocurrency wallet address listed in the note. On February 7th, Savannah Guthrie stood before cameras in Tucson flanked by her brother Cameron and her sister Annie. Her face showed the accumulated weight of 6 days without sleep and without answers. In a carefully worded statement, she confirmed that the family had received a communication from the individuals holding their mother, and she responded directly to the captors. She said the family was ready to pay. The statement represented both a tactical decision and a deeply human one. There was, as Savannah and her siblings acknowledged privately, a profound and terrifying complication. At that point, they had received no proof of life. They did not know with certainty that Nancy was still alive. They did not know whether her heart medication had run out. They were agreeing to pay millions of dollars into a void on faith alone. From the anchor desk in New York, Hoda Kotb watched her closest friend hold herself together with a discipline that most people would have found impossible. Savannah appeared on camera from Tucson looking composed, measured, and precise. Every word chosen, every facial expression controlled. To viewers at home, it read as extraordinary strength. To Hoda, who had known Savannah for nearly 2 decades, it read as something more complicated. Hoda has spoken publicly, in the careful way that close friends speak about each other's vulnerabilities, about recognizing in Savannah's composure the direct imprint of Nancy Guthrie's parenting philosophy. Nancy had raised her children with a clear and unwavering message. When things become difficult, you do not show weakness, you work through it. That message had served Savannah enormously well over the course of a career that required her to anchor the highest-rated morning program in the country, conduct presidential interviews, and process breaking news with millions of people watching. The same internal code that made her one of the most dependable presences in broadcast journalism was now, in the middle of a personal crisis, functioning like a kind of emotional armor she could not remove even when she needed to. In private conversations between New York and Arizona during those 2 weeks, Hoda urged Savannah to allow herself to be human. This was not an easy message to receive, coming as it did from a woman who had been raised by the very person now missing. Hoda's perspective on the matter was informed in part by her own experience. Her daughter Hope's health crisis in 2023 had stripped away whatever professional composure she might have tried to maintain, and what had sustained her through that period was not discipline but connection. When Hope had been hospitalized, the first person to walk through the door had been Savannah. Not a network executive, not a publicist, not a colleague with a professionally appropriate expression of concern. Savannah had simply shown up, which is what you do when someone matters to you. Hoda was now simply returning the gesture, at a scale that required her to reorganize her entire life. She told viewers on the morning of her return that the image of Savannah arriving at the hospital in 2023 had never left her. That memory was, in essence, the explanation for everything, for the surrendered retirement, for the resumed 4 a.m. alarm, for the conversations with her daughters about why she would be back on television for a while. The choice was not difficult. The friendship made it simple. Hoda Kotb understood something that the FBI's press strategy and the network's communications team could not fully account for. In a kidnapping investigation, public attention is not merely sentimental, it is tactical. Kidnappers operate most effectively in the dark. They rely on the assumption that a case will recede from the public consciousness within a news cycle or two, that fatigue will set in, that the story will be displaced by something newer. Hoda had no intention of allowing that to happen. She approached the problem with the instincts of someone who had spent more than a quarter-century learning how to hold an audience's attention and direct their emotional energy. The solution she arrived at was deliberately simple. On the morning of February 9, 2026, she walked onto the set wearing a small yellow silk ribbon pinned to her jacket. Within minutes, without any prior discussion or instruction, every other person on screen, Al Roker, Craig Melvin, the guest contributors, was wearing an identical pin. The decision had a kind of quiet contagion to it. Nobody needed to be asked. They understood what the ribbon meant, and they chose to participate. Yellow, as a symbolic color, carries a long history in American culture as an emblem of waiting, of someone expected home who has not yet returned. By deploying it in the specific visual language of morning television, Hoda was reaching multiple audiences simultaneously. She was sending a message to viewers at home that the case remained urgent and that their attention mattered. She was sending a message to the kidnappers that the entire country was watching and that the spotlight was not going dim. And she was sending a message to Savannah, who was almost certainly watching from a hotel room or a police station in Tucson, that she was not invisible and she was not alone. The response was immediate and extended far beyond anything Hoda or the network had anticipated. Within 48 hours, viewers across the country were photographing yellow ribbons tied to trees in their front yards and sending the images to the show's social media accounts. In Tucson itself, local businesses began distributing yellow carnations, and residents tied yellow fabric to the gates of the neighborhood where Nancy lived. The studio itself was transformed. Hoda worked with the set design team to place yellow roses on the anchor desk and throughout the interview areas, keeping the color visible in every frame of every broadcast. What Hoda was engineering was a national vigil, a sustained collective act of witness that refused to let the story become background noise. She began each morning by highlighting a photograph sent in by a viewer, a ribbon on a mailbox in Maine, a yard sign in California, a church marquee in rural Tennessee. She was converting private sympathy into public solidarity, and she was doing it with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood exactly how television shapes attention. The morning broadcast gave Hoda a platform governed by NBC's editorial standards, the rhythm of commercial breaks, and the professional obligations of a news anchor. Her personal Instagram account gave her something different, the ability to speak without filters, at whatever hour the words came to her, in whatever emotional register felt honest. In the late evenings, after she had put her daughters to bed, Hoda began posting photographs of Nancy and Savannah. Not professional photographs, not images selected by a publicist, but the kind of pictures that accumulate in actual families. Nancy laughing at a birthday party, Savannah, and her mother on a porch somewhere. Candid images from a life lived rather than performed. Beneath many of them, she wrote only a few words: bring her home. The restraint was itself a kind of eloquence. There was nothing to add. In her Instagram stories, she spoke directly to her followers in a more intimate register. She would appear on screen still in her work clothes, but visibly exhausted, sitting in her kitchen after a day that had begun before dawn, asking the people watching to keep sharing Nancy's photograph and to keep calling in tips to the FBI. She was functioning in those late-night posts as something between a friend and a coordinator, channeling the enormous collective energy of her follower base into specific, actionable support for the investigation. Don't stop, she told her followers repeatedly. Keep sharing her face. Kidnappers hate the spotlight. There is a form of grief management that functions by refusing to allow grief to become private, to become contained, to become a thing that happens only to the people directly involved. Hoda seemed to understand intuitively that in Savannah's case, privacy was not the friend. The more people who knew Nancy Guthrie's face, the harder it would be for the perpetrators to operate. The more people who felt personally connected to the story, the more pressure there would be on investigators and on the political leadership responsible for allocating resources. Hoda was not simply a morning show anchor filling airtime. She was functioning as a one-woman advocacy operation, and she was doing it around the clock. While Hoda maintained the public dimension of the search, the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department were pursuing an increasingly sophisticated forensic investigation. The blood evidence from the porch had yielded a DNA profile for an unknown male, and by February 12th, investigators had run that profile through every available national database. While no direct name match emerged, forensic genealogy techniques allowed analysts to narrow the suspect to an individual with a specific ancestral background and set of physical characteristics consistent with the figure captured on the doorbell camera footage. The digital side of the investigation was moving in parallel. The Bitcoin wallet address provided in the ransom note had been created using a cryptocurrency mixer, a service specifically designed to obscure the origin of funds and complicate forensic tracing. The FBI's cyber division had been monitoring the wallet continuously since the note was received. On February 11th, they recorded the first activity in the account, suggesting the kidnappers were testing the transaction pathway. The movement was not the receipt of ransom, it was the kind of probing behavior consistent with someone verifying that a digital escape route was functional. That same day, investigators caught a geographic break. Someone attempted to access the email account used to send the ransom note from a public Wi-Fi network at a truck stop near the New Mexico border. The FBI responded immediately, but the individual was gone by the time agents arrived. The truck stop surveillance footage was seized and reviewed for anyone matching the height and build captured in the